From the Paschal Mystery by Father Rainero Cantalamessa. What does this rite mean? The Paschal Mystery in the Bible and the Fathers. Scarcely had the feast of Passover come into being in Israel, than the question arose as to what exactly it meant. What does this rite of yours mean? Exodus 12:26. Always asked at the beginning of the Jewish Passover supper, the question was to accompany the story of the feast down the ages, inviting all who heard it to a progressively deeper understanding of its meaning. The question is the same in function as that other one, found too in Christian sources. What do we commemorate tonight? Or again, why do we keep vigil on this night? It is important, since it serves to identify the salvific event that lies at the origin of the Passover. In other words, what precisely the Passover is a memorial of. So too, for us Christians, this question can be a valuable tool for acquiring an ever deeper understanding of the Paschal mystery, the two faces of the Passover. To the question, what does this rite mean? The Old Testament gives two different but complementary answers. According to the more ancient explanation, the Feast of Passover primarily commemorates the Passover of God. This word Passover was supposedly derived from a verb indicating the action of God, who passes over, in the sense of skipping or sparing, or protecting the homes of the Hebrews while striking those of their foes. When your children ask you, "What does this rite of yours mean?" you shall reply, "This is the Passover sacrifice, Pesach, of the Lord, who passed over, Pasachti, the houses of the Israelites in Egypt. When he struck down the Egyptians, he spared our houses." Exodus 12:26 through 27. The content, or the event, which the Passover commemorates is therefore the saving passage of God. Passover because God passed over. This is an explanation of the Passover which may be defined as theological or theocentric, since in it the protagonist is God. The emphasis is entirely on the divine initiative, that is to say, on the cause, rather than on the effect, of being saved. In Deuteronomy, and in other less ancient parts of the book of Exodus itself, attention shifts from the moment of sacrificing the lamb to that of the exodus from Egypt, which is seen as a passing from slavery to freedom, Deuteronomy 16, and Exodus 13 through 15. With the changing of the central event, the protagonist or subject of the Passover changes too. No longer is it God who passes and saves, but human beings, the people, who pass and are saved. This is an interpretation of the Passover which may be defined as anthropological or anthropocentric. I have already said that we are dealing with two complementary, not mutually exclusive answers. Human beings, even in this second explanation, are seen as dependent on God. The Exodus prepares for the Sinaitic covenant. So here we have a religious liberation, not a political one, at least not primarily a political one. The nation is set free to serve God, as the biblical sources so often say, "Let my people go, so that they may serve me." Exodus 4:23, 5:1. This twofold interpretation, theological and anthropological, continues throughout the entire Old Testament. At the time of Jesus, we find this inconsistent situation. In official Palestinian Judaism, Dominated by the temple and the Jewish priesthood, the theological interpretation holds sway. The Passover primarily commemorates the passing of God. There is a very fine text in which salvation history is summed up in 4 fundamental events: the creation of the world, the sacrifice of Isaac, the Passover, and the end of the world, the 4 nights. In this particular text, the Passover is described as the night in which God manifested himself against the Egyptians and protected the firstborn of Israel. In this environment, which was the environment of Jesus, the Passover presents a strongly ritual and sacrificial aspect. It consists, that is to say, in a concrete liturgy, the essential moments of which are the sacrificing of the lamb in the temple at dusk on the 14th of Nisan, and the eating of it in family groups the same night at the Passover supper. In Hellenistic or diaspora Judaism, on the other hand, the anthropological explanation predominates. There, the central historical event commemorated by the Passover is the people's crossing of the Red Sea. But even this is relegated to second place as regards the allegorical meaning of the event, which is the passing of the individual from slavery to freedom, from vice to virtue. The most famous representative of this school of thought writes, "The feast of Passover is a memorial of and a thanksgiving for the great emigration from Egypt. But for those who are accustomed to turning what they are told into allegory, the feast of Passover signifies the purification of the soul. Properly speaking, Passover means the passing over from all passion to that which is intelligible and divine. Migration, exodus, passing over, exit are images of great spiritual resonance, especially if seen in the context of that biblical mentality which regarded Abram's emigration, and indeed emigration in general, as the physical model of the faith and destiny of Israel. My father was a wandering Aramaean, and which was to be extended in the New Testament in the ideal of living as aliens and sojourners. 1 Peter 2:11, Hebrews 11:13. If the Passover is essentially the passing over from vice to virtue, evidently it will not have God for subject, but human beings, and it will not be celebrated so much with a liturgy and outward ceremonies, though these will not be repudiated, as with a continual and inner striving toward the good. The Paschal lamb to be offered to God is one's own spiritual progress, Philo said, going back to the etymological meaning of the Greek term used to designate the Paschal victim, probaton, lamb, kid-goat, coming from probaino, meaning I go forward, I progress. Thus we have seen 2 mutually contrasting Paschal concepts take shape. These will survive into Christianity and, with their dialectic, mold all Paschal spirituality right to our own day. Let us pass on, then, from the Jewish to the Christian Passover. But first of all, one question. When did a Christian feast of Passover first come into existence? The primitive Christian community after the death of Jesus, though it continued for a little while to go up to the temple and celebrate the Passover with the rest of the Jews, began at a certain point to regard and live this annual festival no longer as a memorial of the events of the Exodus and as a waiting for the coming of the Messiah, but rather as a memorial of what a few years earlier had happened in Jerusalem at one particular Passover, and as a waiting for the return of Christ. The inward dissociation preceded the ritual one, and the Christian feast of the Passover was celebrated in spirit and in truth, in the depth of the disciples' hearts, before it acquired a rite and feast day of its own. This, however, was not long in coming. once the inward transformation of the Passover's content had taken place within them. And perhaps when St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 5:8 exhorts his converts to celebrate the feast, it is already to the Christian feast that he is alluding. Thus it came about that the yearly return of the Passover came to be celebrated by the disciples with a special feast day, the novelty of which they became increasingly aware. How did such a swift and sharply defined transplantation of the Paschal institution from Old to New Testament, from Israel to the Church, take place? Apparently, the point of contact was a purely chronological fact. Christ died and rose again in Jerusalem on the occasion of a Jewish Passover. For St. John the Evangelist, his death actually coincided with the sacrificing of the Paschal lambs in the temple. This chronological datum alone would certainly not have been enough to work the grand transformation of the Passover, if within it another, stronger datum had not been at work, the typological one. That event, the sacrificing of Christ, was seen as fulfilling all the figures and all the expectations in the old Passover. Melito of Sardis expresses this conviction in words that deliberately follow very closely the Johannine treatment of the Incarnation, as though inferring that the Easter mystery is but the last line and consistent conclusion of a process that began with the Incarnation. The law has become word, the old has become the new, the figure has become reality, and the Lamb become the Son. In the light of this event, the New Testament writers were to reinterpret the entire Jesus story, seeing in it the definitive fulfillment of the old Passover. The Church has thus inherited her Passover feast from Israel, but in its passage from Israel to the Church, it has changed its content. It has become the memorial of something else. And so once more we ask the ancient question, what does this rite mean?